So we're going to be continuing this week and looking at the book of Ezekiel. We looked the last couple weeks at the beginning, which has a lot to do with the fall of Jerusalem. We have Ezekiel offering kind of a lot of judgments, trying to wean his people off this false hope that things are going to go back to the way they were. He has been taken from his home, he's in exile, and everyone kind of just wants to go back to the way things are. And a lot of his early message is saying, no, the rot, the just moral filth that is being perpetuated by my people right now is too strong for such an easy fix. And so at the end of all these judgments of God definitively saying through Ezekiel, through some street theater, through some truly bizarre imagery, but these will all culminate in Ezekiel predicting the fall of Jerusalem. His hometown, which he is no longer in, which is 1,000 miles away, is going to be burned to the ground. And there's a very interesting kind of pair of prophecies of parallels there right at the end, because God gives Ezekiel the bad news. He says, your wife is going to die, and when she does, I don't want you to go into traditional mourning. It's going to freak people out because they know how much you love your wife. But I'm asking you to be put in the situation that many people back home are going to be in. I'm asking you to be in the situation I find myself in. And so, God, as he describes this fall of Jerusalem, there's nothing triumphant about it. There's nothing gloating, God, venting his wrath or whatever that's supposed to mean. You get the image of these two widowers, these two very almost broken men sitting there trying to comfort one another because Ezekiel has lost his wife and God has lost the city of Jerusalem. He's lost his people, who both in Ezekiel's imagery and in other places of the Bible, God's holy people are often referred to as this image of God's wife. So we've got these kind of two broken men at the end of all this judgment. So the next section we're going to look at shifts gears considerably after Ezekiel has both lived and given this message that we cannot go back, we cannot look and hope things are the way they used to be. The judgment has fallen. We need to move forward. We need to do something new. God is going to shift his focus on foreign nations because he doesn't want many of these nations to think that just because this judgment has happened to his own people, that they are entirely without fault themselves. And so these prophecies with other nations are very traditional. They show up in a lot of different prophets' writing. But in Ezekiel, they're really important because they're just reminding God's people and the other nations of God's universal scope. God expects a certain level of moral responsibility from all people, even those who don't have kind of the full revealed law as God's people do, who had a special identity as representing God to the world. But these people, these other nations that Ezekiel will talk about, also bear some responsibility. They have their own moral codes. They have their own sense of conscience that they are not living up to, and God needs to remind them that they too, are kind of on His radar. So this section starts with kind of the neighboring nations. So it's these other small nations like Israel. We're talking like nations like Ammon and Moab and Edom, these little countries around that are gloating, basically. They watched Jerusalem be destroyed in these series of battles, destroyed by Babylon, and they're traditional enemies. They're right next to each other. They fought a lot of battles over the years, and they're being opportunistic. And God brings this judgment saying, yes, I see what you're doing to my people. I see that you are hurting people who are already hurting. I see that you're gloating. And there seems to be a piece of it where he's scolding them for being kind of short-sighted, because it seems like there was some kind of a political contract between these groups, like, hey, maybe we should rally together against kind of this big bad politically, which is Babylon. And they refused because they just didn't like the people. And in the end, this seems very short-sighted because, of course, Babylon is going to come and squash like bugs all these other smaller nations as well. And so they start out with these kind of neighboring things, but the bulk of these prophecies, of these judgments against nations, fall on two specific countries, neither of which was particularly a neighbor, but both of which were large enough to stand up to Babylon in some ways, and were, I guess, lacking. They did not do their job. They didn't do what they could have. They became kind of false hopes as well for God's people. So the first of these is the city state of Tyre, the Phoenician. I'm not sure if it's a capital, but it's one of their major cities. And then the other is going to be the country of Egypt. And I want to talk just real briefly about kind of how prophecy sometimes works. We use this word in English, and I think the association largely has to do with like foretelling, predicting the future, right? This is what we're used to from movies and fiction. And that aspect is there for biblical prophecy, but it's not a major one. I would say rather than foresight, most of the time in the Bible, prophecy is much more about insight, about giving God's perspective on things in a world that feels too big or too out of control. God will often give the prophets a special insight into kind of what his evaluation of things are and what's going on. And sometimes this does include kind of future judgments or future things that are going to happen. But that's not the major purpose of it. It's to give, again, kind of God's perspective and God's insight. I think because we've over-focused on this foretelling aspect, people can get kind of frustrated historically. So one of the prophecies or groups of prophecies we're talking about in here was about Tyre. And Tyre, one of the things that's claimed in here is this city-state of Tyre is going to be burned to the ground. And people who see prophecy as some kind of a code or something that is going to be literally fulfilled every time get very frustrated by this because, as far as we can tell, the city of Tyre never really was burned to the ground. And so does that mean God was lying? Does that mean Ezekiel misheard? And you see these kind of theological, historical, twisting and turning, trying to figure out what was meant by, well, Babylon actually meant, Alexander the Great, who would sort of sack it later, but didn't really burn it to the ground. And so people are really worried about kind of getting these details right. We see this same mentality in the way people approach kind of the apocalyptic literature, whether it's here or in the New Testament. They're looking for this kind of code that's going to tell them the key to the future. So here are the future events. If we slot this thing here, then this equals this, which equals this. And I don't think that this is actually how God is wanting us to approach these things. And frankly, I don't think most of the time, most of us probably care about how literal this prophecy about the city of Tyre was, because this is a city that ceased to exist in any meaningful way, 2,500 years ago. If God is totally right about it, if God is totally wrong about it, I mean, who cares, right? What is this even doing in the Bible? Why are we reading these prophecies all these years later, half the world away, about what bad things are going to happen to the city of Tyre? And so I think a more helpful way is to recognize that passages like this, passages of prophecy that are giving God's insight into the way things are much more helpful if we think of them as these major archetypes that God is pointing out again and again. We may be tempted to put our trust in, right? That's what a lot of Ezekiel is. Are we putting our trust in the correct places? Are we putting our trust in God or in something else? And so I think the fact that the city of Tyre shows up here, it's not just about this literal city of Tyre, although they meet this archetype, which here I think is for economic power. But there's going to be a very similar kind of lament to the one I'm going to read in just a second later in the book of Revelation about, except this time it's the city of Babylon. Babylon is now the economic power, and this is what God thinks of Babylon now. I think you can read it forward and backward throughout history. You can read it onto kind of contemporary politics. You can read it into historical movements. Just recognizing the fact this is kind of God's view of, yes, Tyre or whatever its latest historical incarnation is, this economic power. So I want to read a little piece of kind of this lament that is given over the king of Tyre after God points out that he's going to be destroyed. So I am in, Ezekiel chapter 28, starting at verse 11. And so just listen and ask yourself this. Does this description sound like some king in the ancient world, or does it sound like there might be a little bit more going on? The Lord's word came to me. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Down at verse 11. The Lord's word came to me. Human one, sing a lament for the king of Tyre. Say to him, the Lord God proclaims, you were full of wisdom and beauty, the image of perfection. You were in Eden, God's garden. You were covered with gold and every precious stone, carnelian, topaz, moonstone, beryl, onyx, and jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and emerald. On the day that you were created, finely crafted pendants and engravings were prepared. You, a winged creature, were installed as a guardian. I placed you in God's holy mountain where you walked among the stones of fire. And from the day you were created until injustice was found in you, your ways were assured. But because of your trade, your oppressive business practices piled up and you became impure. And so I expelled you from God's mountain. I removed you, winged creature, guardian, from among the stones of fire. You exalted yourself because of your beauty and corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I will cast you down to the earth in the sight of kings, and I will make a spectacle of you. Because of your corrupt trade, which surpassed your many other sins, you made your sanctuaries impure. Therefore, I will bring fire from your midst, and when it has consumed you, I will turn you into dust of the earth in the sight of all who see you. Everyone among the peoples who knows of you will be appalled because of you. You will become a terror. From this time on, you will be nothing. So as you read that passage, it's a little hard to assume it's just talking about this historical king, which we don't even know their name or what happened to them. And yet we're considering this all these years later. And this is actually one of the passages that gets pulled out when people are trying to guess at who exactly the devil is or who Lucifer is, right? The Bible never directly tells us this kind of common understanding that he was once an angel who became a fallen angel, and passages like this are used because obviously this king of Tyre was not there at in Eden. He's talked about these living stones he's around. Interestingly, he's wearing the same set of jewels that a priest would have worn. And so I think the imagery is strong and it's weird, but it gives us the idea of, okay, Tyre has gone from being just an economic power to something else entirely, right? It has gone on to have a religious significance. Its economic strength has gone on to mean much more than just this city and its physical prosperity. And I think that archetype, whether we're applying it back to kind of, hey, maybe it was pride and beauty, and trying to think of itself greater than it was, that was what caused the downfall of the devil, whether it was this king of Tyre, whether it's going to be other empires that the Bible talks about, like Rome or Alexander the Great, all the way down until modern times, we're going to see this archetype and this stamp, this thought that money is strength, that money and economic means show prosperity, that this can ultimately be something that gives meaning and can save us. And God's rebuke of that here and many other places in the Bible is a really important one for us nowadays because we are so aware of economics. Many of us are very comfortable financially, and yet God condemns this and says this has become a first thing in your life. It is bigger than it was meant to be. And so I think the fact that this shows up at Eden in this passage reminds us that it isn't necessarily a bad thing. But think about the amount of teaching that Jesus did about money as well, right? About holding it too closely, about it becoming our God and not God. And in the situation, this extreme situation that Ezekiel and his friends found themselves in, it can be tempting to think that some kind of prosperity can come about through business, that can ultimately free us and save us and make our lives full and worth living. And God here, God many other places, just as he rejects this king of Tyre for being too prideful, for having too much, for not understanding the purpose of comfort and wealth, I think we have to be very careful that we are also not turning to those things, especially as rich Americans, that we recognize the place of wealth in those things, that they are subordinate to God's ways. As Job says, God can give and God can take those away. That does not change who we are. It does not change who God is. And so I think we just need to challenge ourselves with this a little bit, just saying, okay, how much of our culture says we're valuable if we can earn money, right? What's the first question we always hear from people? Like, what do you do? And they're not talking about how do you spend your time. We're almost always talking about what is it you do for a living? Where is your work? How do you earn money? And the more we have, the more valuable we have. And we feel insecure. We feel like things are going to fall apart if there's not enough money in our bank account, if we are living hand to mouth. And Jesus does promise to take care of us, right? And yet, how much of our time and our energy is spent on the accumulation of this stuff that was rejected, the economic. I mean, how much of even like political parties and things in the world nowadays believe that, it's going to be economic or business means that are ultimately going to save us from our current world predicament. We get another example just a few verses later of another of these archetypes. This time it's Egypt. Egypt, I think, representing power and military strength. I won't spend as much time on this one, but I think we get the idea, right? God is rejecting the economic as kind of the ultimate arbiter of meaning, as it ultimately will give pleasure and comfort, what will ultimately bring the full life. He rejects that idea no matter what its historical guise. Another temptation for both Ezekiel's day and us nowadays is to think of power, control, or military might, that sort of thing, as being the ultimate thing that shows goodness and strength and guarantees where we're supposed to be in life. And to that, and to this historical king of Egypt as well, and to every other historical person or movement that falls into this pit as well, God says this. So in the 10th year, on the 12th day of the 10th month, the Lord's word came to me. Human one, face Pharaoh, Egypt's king, and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. Speak and say, the Lord God proclaims, I'm against you, Pharaoh, Egypt's king, the great crocodile lurking in the Nile's canals, who says, the Nile is all mine, I made it for myself. I will set hooks in your jaws. I will make the fish of the Nile's canals cling to your scales. I will drag you from the Nile's canals, and also all the fish from the Nile's canals clinging to your scales. I will fling you out into the desert, also all the fish from the Nile's canals. You will fall upon open ground and won't be gathered or retrieved. I've given you to the beasts of the earth and the birds in the sky for food, because everyone living in Egypt will know I'm the Lord. Because they were a flimsy crutch for the house of Israel. When they took you in hand, you would splinter and make their shoulders sore. When they leapt onto you, you will break, bringing them to their knees. Now the Lord God proclaims, I'm bringing a sword against you. I will cut off from you human and beast. The land of Egypt will be turned to a wasteland and ruins. Then they will know that I'm the Lord. I love this image of this broken walking stick that is used here, this thing that they put their weight on, that they tried to rest on, that was supposed to help them get through life, get through the mountain, the political and the military strength of Egypt ended up betraying them. It wasn't enough. When the chips were down, Egypt wasn't there, and they suffered greatly because of it. And I think this is the fate that will continue to be for those who rely on violence, for those who rely on power or forcing their beliefs onto others or control as one of the major factors in life. So again, we see this very much in our modern political situations. We see this desire in ourselves for control. We see all throughout human history these big, scary nations and movements, whether they were Egypt or, again, Babylon or Rome. Go through recent history, the Nazi Party, the communists in Russia, those sorts of things. There have been many big, powerful groups that looked absolutely unbeatable in their time. And they have faded away. They are footnotes in history. They are broken because they were relied upon. And so control is not ultimately going to give us meaning. Comfort and pleasure and money and economics are not ultimately going to give us meaning. And so this series of prophecies of rejecting some of the things that we may want to put our trust in, of God saying, no, ultimately, I am the Lord. I am the one you should be putting your trust in. It's a humbling thing because we are so used to seeking control, to seeking money and comfort and pleasure. And God rejects those things and says, no, ultimately, where your trust needs to be in, again, is not in those things, but in me. Not in economic or powers, historical manifestations, whatever movement, whatever person, whatever historical entity that is. I say the same thing as I did about these kings all these years ago. Reject them. They are not going to be enough. Only I am going to be enough, and only I am ultimately worthy of your trust.